It's unprecedented in the history of the European Parliament. The vote to punish a member state. Hungary is accused of flouting EU rules on democracy, civil rights and corruption. The government's attacks on courts and media seen as a threat. So what's next for Hungary and indeed Europe? This is Inside Story. Okay, so let's introduce our panel. In Brussels, Peter Kleppe, head of the Brussels office for the think tank Open Europe. In Berlin, Martin Michalski, director of public affairs at the Polish-based Open Dialogue Foundation. And in Avignon, in France, Baptiste Roger-Lacan, the co-founder of the Groupe of Geopolitical Studies. Welcome to you all. Baptiste, let me start with you. When the EU says that there was a serious breach of European values, what does it mean exactly?
To be fair, it's quite hard to interpret. It's a very wide concept. The EU values are defined in the second article of the Treaty of Lisbon, and they cover a wide branch of values, which are human dignity, human rights, the rule of law. And when you look at the report that was written by this Dutch lawmaker that was interviewed, you can see that there are actually quite a bunch of those values that have been breached at one point or another by the Hungarian government. And but the main problem being that those values being very wide and quite undefined, it's also pretty hard to exactly pinpoint where the issues are. So it's mostly a question, I think, of political willingness rather than strictly judicial approach.
Okay, Baptiste, do you agree, or what's your reaction to what was just said, that maybe the European Union has double standards?
To be fair, I mean, I could agree on the fact that there is some sort of double standard, in the sense that no measure of the sort. It would have been more complicated for Spain or Italy or France to be condemned like this by the EU Parliament. However, I do think that given the number of breaches from the Hungarian government, this particular activation of Article 7 was actually made sense. And more than that, I do think that the EU should not only be concerned with the opening of free trade, but also with defending its core values. And if I might say so, you pointed that the EU has existed for many decades now. It is true. And maybe we're so surprised by the fact that Article 7 was used only for the first time right now, because it should have been used many times before. The fact is that Viktor Orban has been in power for many years right now, and that he's been slowly building his own doctrine, his own approach, not only to Hungary, but also to Europe, which completely contradicts the core values on which the EU has been founded, core values which are defined or at least identified in Article 2. And I think it was about time that the EU, or at least those who believe in the liberal construction of the European Union, did something about it. The question is now, what are going to be the political consequences of such a brash action? Because no one is actually used to the European Parliament acting so swiftly and actually making such a strong statement.
At the end of the day, the EU has been quite upset with Viktor Orban for a few years now. But you do get the impression that it was standing by, watching things unfold. Hungary gets nearly $5.5 billion per year, about more than 4% of its GDP comes from the EU. So why didn't it take any steps before? Because, I mean, you can't have the cake and eat it at the same time, right?
The thing is that it's extremely complicated to act inside the EU. The fact that it is both a set of institutions which are independent and function with their own rules, their own laws, etc., and then a certain number of member states who have their own diplomatic and geopolitical agendas, makes it complicated to find a consensus and actually act when one of the state goes, so to say, rogue. So I think that explains, that's one of the explanations. The other one might be because Viktor Orban actually, I mean, he's been breaching EU values for a long time, but he evolved slowly from a post-communist liberal in the 1990s to what he is today, which is probably way closer to a far-right authoritarian leader. And I think this evolution and the fact that he is the leader of a country that was part of the Eastern Bloc, which are countries that the EU has tried to integrate and not alienate since their integration in the EU, explains why the European institutions and especially in Parliament, the conservative group of which Viktor Orban and his party, the Fidesz, is still part, didn't act sooner. I think it's a conjunction, a convergence of a lot of different factors, which is often the problem with the EU, being that not only do you have to accord 28 states together, but you also have to balance this with different institutions which might have different agendas in a never-moving situation.
I mean, all this is certainly also having not an impact not only on Hungary, but on the European Union itself, on the European People's Party and its future. How do you see that unfold? Do you think if you alienate Viktor Orban any further, he could split and maybe, as many fear, form another party which would be made essentially of these far-right groups that are becoming more and more popular in many countries?
Actually, I think he might be expelled of the EPP before being able to leave the party. I think it's very interesting that it happened, that this Article 7 vote happened a few months before the 2019 elections. And it's even more interesting to see that inside the EPP, Manfred Weber, who will probably be the candidate of the EPP at the head of the commission in a few months, actually decided to vote in favor of Article 7, even though up to a few weeks ago, he was actually one of the defenders of Viktor Orban inside the party, meaning that he's actually trying to recenter himself and find his balance more at the center of the EPP by dropping Orban and trying to basically find a larger platform on which he can be elected in a few months. So I think that Orban being expelled or leaving the EPP is going to be a major clarification inside the party. It's interesting to see as well that Sebastian Kurz, even though he's allied, who's the Austrian chancellor, even though he's allied to the far right in his own country, actually disavowed Viktor Orban a few weeks ago as well, showing that there is a form of distanciation from Viktor Orban. So he probably is going to build a new alliance, probably with Matteo Salvini, maybe Marine Le Pen in France. However, the EPP is recentering itself, or at least has started to block its evolution towards the far right, which is probably good news for Manfred Weber. It's probably bad news for Emmanuel Macron, who is trying to rebuild his national and European image over the European elections by destroying the EPP, or at least sectioning it in half. And with this move from Manfred Weber and the fact that Viktor Orban seems that Viktor Orban has lost a lot of allies inside his political family, it seems that the EPP is actually not going to be so easy to crack, and that Macron is actually going to have a harder time getting the momentum he wanted to gain inside to gain the European elections.